This is a hat trick
podcast.
Oh, lovely.
Hello, Jimmy.
Hello, Armand. So this week, it's one of my favourites, one of my favourite expressions from the classical world. I am very excited. Why should I be excited?
Sunt Lacrimae Rerum. There are tears of things. Does that sound interesting to you?
Well, you see, the thing is, here's what happened to me. When I first came across Sunt Lacrimae Rerum, I was about 16 years of age, and I was asked to translate it at school. And I literally translated, there are tears of things. There are tears of things. And I said to the teacher, what does that mean? He said, it's pretty untranslatable. So you've picked something which is pretty untranslatable for us to discuss this week.
Yeah, okay. Well, we're going to have to work out what it means, but it has a context, and we'll talk about the context. It occurs at a moment in the first book of Virgil's Aeneid. So who is Virgil? What is the Aeneid? What is the story of Aeneas, the hero of the Aeneid? All these things are wrapped up in that particular phrase. There are tears of things.
So let me ask you then, what is the Aeneid?
Okay, well, first of all, let's pronounce it right. In English, it's the Aeneid.
Okay, all right.
A-E.
You're a professor who's like pedantic. That's so unusual.
Oh, isn't it unusual? Yes. His name in Latin, and indeed in Greek, consists of three long syllables. Aeneas. So that's his name, Aeneas. And he is a Trojan hero who fights in the Trojan War against the Greeks. And, of course, the Greeks sack the city of Troy. The Achaeans, as they were called, sack the city of Troy, and Aeneas flees into exile. And so that was part of the original myth of Aeneas. But what then happens is he becomes implicated in the whole story of the growth of Rome. So, of course, you have the Greeks first, and then you have the growth of Rome, the greatest city in the world in the 1st century BC. The Romans conquer the Greek world, in fact. But they are always conscious that there's this myth which tells of how Aeneas came from Troy and founded Rome. So you've got this Trojan coming through the seas from Greece across the Aegean Sea. He gets blown off course to the northern coast of Africa. He gets through Sicily and eventually gets to Italy. And there he founds a city which will become the greatest city in the world, Rome. But the story is told in the Aeneid as a sort of foundation myth of Rome itself.
And so Virgil was this bloke who wrote it.
Yeah.
And was he a kind of rock star poet at the time?
Sort of. I mean, his patron was Maecenas. Maecenas was a great friend of Octavius, who became known as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, who kept putting pressure on Maecenas to get his little coterie of poets, Virgil, there was Horace, there were one or two others, to try and write something patriotic. Because in those days, of course, they didn't have films, they didn't have television, they had poetry. And a great poem, especially a great epic poem, long, written in hexameters like Homer's Iliad, this would be the thing that would disseminate the glory and triumph of Augustus, who, in a way, after the civil wars in the 1st century BC, there were terrible civil wars that went on in Rome. Augustus emerges triumphant. He refounds the world of Rome in his own propaganda.
And so Virgil was paid to do this by Maecenas?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know exactly. I mean, there was clearly some transactional element.
Some kind of patronage was going on.
Yeah, I mean, he was given stuff. He may have been given money. Yes, of course. You are a poet. You need a patron in order to actually survive writing poetry, and presumably also reciting and occasionally performing the poetry. But Maecenas gets Virgil eventually to write this great epic, the Aeneid. So Virgil tries out one or two other things first. This is, in a way, his third great work. And he finally comes round to the idea, yes, I can write an epic about the founding of Rome. And it's going to have to be centred on this Trojan hero, Aeneas. But the poem immediately went into circulation as the national epic. It was copied more than any other, and it was used as a school text. And it became what?
Even in those days, used as a school text?
Yes, immediately.
Right.
And it was seen as the great Roman work. And so the Aeneid then becomes what T.S. Eliot called the classic of all Europe. It is this great European classic because it doesn't just tell a story, it also has a teleology, and that's a complicated word for saying it has a view to which it aims, a telos in Greek, an end point. And that view is the glory of Rome. So it still survives as this enormous promotion of the greatness of Rome. And that's what makes it a great story, as well as the story of the killings and the love affairs and so on. Because that's how the myth goes. Aeneas comes eventually to Italy and creates a city. But it's what the eventually is. It's because Aeneas, like Homer's hero Odysseus, goes through lots of adventures before he actually gets to Italy. And in the first book of Virgil's Aeneid, so that's the story of Aeneas, his Aeneid, he gets to Carthage, which is, of course, on the northern shore of Africa. And there, he's shipwrecked, and he thinks he might have landed amongst barbarian people, and he comes across a temple. And on the temple, there are relief images of a scene of Achilles pulling Hector behind his chariot. Now, this is the final scene from Homer's Iliad, one of the final scenes when Achilles, having killed Hector, drags him round the walls of Troy. And Aeneas sees that, and you would have thought he would think, oh my God, that'll bring me back to the terrible trauma of the sack of Troy.
Very triggering.
Yeah.
We would say now.
We would say triggering, exactly.
Aeneas would say, I'm being triggered.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Is he being triggered?
What is the Latin for triggered?
Good question.
Okay, we'll come back to that. I like asking you a question that
that's a very
you
good
don't
one.
know the answer to.
Lewis and Shaw. Yes. So will he be triggered by this? The thing is, he sees this and he thinks, these people know culture, they know history, they know the story of Troy. They must be civilized people. They're not. We haven't fallen amongst barbarians. And he says the words, Sunt Lacrimae Rerum. There are tears of things. They know how to cry when they are confronted by something sad. That is what he means by that. It goes on, et mentem mortalia tangunt, and mortality, things about death, touches their mind. So that is what he takes away from this image. It's actually an incredibly hopeful thing. These are people who, he says, we've come among, who have a sense of mortality, a sense of sadness in the face of
humanity.
Death and yes, a sense of humanity. These are human beings. So let's say he's seeing the thongs that are pulling Hector around the walls of Troy attached to the chariot of Achilles. And this was thought to be a barbaric and awful thing by the Greeks themselves. So Achilles is not doing himself any favours.
A war crime, you might say.
It was very much a war crime, and understood to be a war crime by both Greeks and Romans. So why is Aeneas taking some kind of relief from the idea that this is what is being depicted? It's a very interesting question, because obviously what he's assuming is that people are looking at this or hearing the story of the Iliad, so perhaps the frieze is a substitute for the idea that they know the story, and are feeling how awful it is. Now, it is, of course, possible they'd be looking at it and thinking, jolly good, but it's clear to him, his immediate notion is that they're looking at this awful image and thinking, this is awful for Hector, this is terrible for the Trojans.
It's the same kind of thing that we would get, for example, when I remember being in Vietnam and going around the War Museum there and seeing some of the images there and just the horror that you feel.
I think Picasso's Guernica is another example of that. You know, you have a sense of horrible things happening, and you look at it and you realise that this is meant to make you feel Sunt Lacrimae Rerum. Things are full of tears.
I think that when you read the line itself, Sunt Lacrimae Rerum, there's a kind of sadness to it, isn't it? People have projected onto it that it's quite a sad line. And what you're saying, actually, well, it's hopeful because we're all of us have a pool of sadness within us, I guess.
Exactly. Yes. And the fact that we can recognise sadness makes us human beings. So I first probably came across the phrase out of context on a war memorial at my school, where it had a list of names and above it says Sunt Lacrimae Rerum. It's often used actually as the heading for war memorials. And it does mean life is sad in that context, but that's out of the context of the Aeneid itself. There, as I say, it's about recognising our common humanity.
Lacrima, meaning tear. I mean, we use it, don't we, when we say lachrymose?
Lachrymose, yes. So that, of course, comes from the Latin root, as a lot of our words do, directly from Latin roots. Lacrima is related to the Greek word for tears, which is dakrua. So d and l very often get intermixed in these so-called Indo-European roots. And there are no actual words that we use in daily English that are related to that, other than those that come directly from the Latin, lachrymose, because, of course, our word is tears. And tears has a Germanic root, as so much of English does. In fact, is related to a word meaning to tear. So, tears and tear are not actually unrelated words.
Can I ask you, did people in Rome at that time, that they be listening or reading the Aeneid, did they cry more than we do? Was it more acceptable for people to weep?
It was certainly acceptable for men to weep. In Greece and Rome, we hear a lot about weeping. Both the heroes of the Iliad and the Aeneid are able. It's not seen as something negative. Right. It's not like real men don't weep or anything like that.
And this quote is from the first book, isn't it, of the Aeneid? So this is where it all kicks off. And there are some really good translations of it, aren't there, for people who don't want to...
Great translations, yes.
Schlep through the Latin. And it's a rattling good yarn, isn't it?
It is a good story. Some people would say it's not as rattling a good tale as the Iliad or the Odyssey, because there's this political dimension to it. And we are aware of that throughout. We as Romans, as it were, we as the readers are thinking, we know this is leading towards a story of the foundation of a city that maps onto the notion of Augustus refounding the Rome of today. And some people would say it's not as good as the originals by Homer. Yeah. Well, to some degree it is. It's the idea of the story of a hero going back to his homeland. There's another complexity there.
The nostos.
A nostos, the nostalgia.
Nostalgia, see? Nostos is the return.
Return to one's homeland.
And then nostalgia is the ache.
The ache of
return. Of wanting to return. Yeah.
So the ache of wanting to return is what gets Odysseus back to Ithaca, but it is also mapped onto the story of Aeneas getting to Italy, because at some historical level, Aeneas's grandfather Dardanus was said to have come from Italy and gone to Asia Minor, which is where Troy is. So in a way, he's returning to his ancestral country.
Here's a question, is that when I was a kid, I said to my teacher, so basically Virgil has just ripped this idea off. And he said, no. Plagiarism in the ancient world wasn't the same as plagiarism. I mean, you must be, in your world, the academic world, you're absolutely paranoid of being plagiaristic in any way.
Especially now.
Here you are dealing with artists and great writers who quite freely borrow themes from their predecessors.
Yeah, but they're doing it in another language.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the Romans are plagiarizing in the sense they're modeling their stories on those of the Greeks. But that is what they are intending to do. That is what makes for a great Roman writer, someone who can be Homer in Latin, or who can be a lyric poet in Latin. That's what Horace claims to be doing. So they're taking these Greek stories and these Greek themes and sometimes actual Greek mottos, words, and they're translating them into Latin. And Virgil does this brilliantly. It's not quite plagiarism because, of course, it's an adaptation.
Yeah. I haven't got a problem with it. In fact, in my business, in TV, you will get new versions of old stories. I mean, there are 7 stories to be told, apparently, and we reversion them. It's the execution of them. It's what you then bring to it yourself, which turns it into something which is unique.
Yes.
That's my view of it. But these days, we seem to have a kind of puritanical view of plagiarism, I guess because of the money involved. But actually, they are creating something new, aren't they?
Of course. I mean, there is no such thing as the new without the old. So the new is based on the old. So in
That's
some
the
ways,
point of our podcast.
Absolutely. The new comes from the old.
Yeah.
And the roots of Virgil's Aeneid are Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, both of them. So he begins the Aeneid, Arma virumque cano. I sing of battles and of a man. The battles reminds us of the Iliad, which is mainly about fighting. The man is Aeneas. It would have been Odysseus. So I'm combining the battles of the Iliad with the story of the adventures of a single individual, a single hero in the Odyssey, and creating the Aeneid. So he's doing something more than just borrowing. He's combining.
And it kind of turns it around, doesn't it? Because he whereas Homer begins with the war and ends with the nostos, with the return home. In fact, what Virgil does rather brilliantly is he allows us 6 books with the man. And on his personal journey, his personal quests, the falling in love with Dido, the leaving her, the loss of his great friend Palinurus when he arrives. He arrives at Italy, and it's a sad moment. It's Sunt Lacrimae Rerum, because the first thing they do is they have to grieve the loss of his great friend Palinurus. So even then, at the moment of, great, we're in Italy now, there's a little moment where he says, something, yes. It's not without cost.
That's right. It was a very costly business for Aeneas to found Rome. And that's a line from Book 1 of Virgil again, Book 1, line 33. He says, Tantae molis erat Romanam condere gentem. It was such hard work to found the Roman race. And it's something slightly meta-literary about that phrase, because the word condere, to found, yes, also means to compose a poem. So, in a way, it's such hard work for Virgil to compose a poem about the founding of the Roman race.
A victory for hard work.
A victory for hard work.
This is where I've got to fess up. I spent the last 40 years thinking that occurred in Book 6.
Why did you think it occurred
so
in Book 6?
Here goes. Because for my A-level I studied Book 6, in my mind I'd framed it as when Aeneas is going across the Styx with Charon, and he sees the souls on the banks of the people who are suicides and the other people, that's where the line occurs, is that it's Sunt Lacrimae Rerum.
Yes, okay, so Book 6, let's just recap here. This is when Aeneas goes down to the underworld.
Yeah.
So he's got to Cumae in Italy, which is Bay of Naples, and that's where the Sibyl, the prophetess,
yes,
lives. And the prophetess tells him to go down to the underworld and tells him how he can do that. And he goes down, and as you say, he sees the souls of dead people. It would have been, perhaps, a point at which Sunt Lacrimae Rerum would have been.
Yeah, I think he should have used it there, actually. If I can give Virgil a note.
Yeah. Maybe he could have repeated it. But as it is, he doesn't say it there. He says other things, of course. He says other things about the sadness of seeing people who he knew and who are now dead, such as the Queen Dido, this figure in the Aeneid. Virgil very cleverly starts off by making her very sympathetic, someone who essentially welcomes Aeneas to her Carthaginian new city. Carthage itself means new city in Phoenician. Kartadasht means new city. By the way, there are lots of cities called new city. When you found a city, you call it new city. Neapolis. Neapolis became Naples. So that was a new city for the Greeks once. And in fact, so many Greek speakers still live in southern Italy. I think about 250,000 still speaking Greek as their main language.
And of course, that was Magna Graecia, wasn't it?
Indeed,
that
was Magna Graecia. It was called the Greater Greece.
I mean, it's a fantastic place because it predates Rome, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's ancient Greece in Italy.
And Cumae is right there, isn't it?
And Cumae is a Greek name. It was Cumae in Greek. They founded it in the 8th century BC. They founded Naples as a new city.
And tell me about the lake, because there's a lake there called Averno.
Lake Avernus, that's right.
Aorno.
Without birds, because of the nephitic, that is the sulphurous emanations from this lake. Birds died.
But didn't the ancients think because it sits above Hades?
Exactly,
there are no birds
it sits above the underworld.
But actually, it's because it's a volcanic...
Yeah.
kind of bay, isn't it? I mean, the whole bay is volcanic. It's not just Vesuvius, but there's little volcanoes all over the place.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. So Avernus is actually considered to be one of the lakes leading to the underworld. And as you say, it's aornos, so think of the word ornithological.
Ornithological?
Yeah, so a is without, as in a, we use it as a negative, as in we say amoral. And so aornos is without birds, and you get Avernus.
It's come Avernos.
Yes.
Averno.
Yes. But Dido, she's founded a new city, and she's saying, welcome, be part of my new city.
And he spends 4 books with her, doesn't he? There are 4,
absolutely. So out of 12 books of the Aeneid, 1/3 takes place in Carthage.
Well, I was going to say, because he meets Dido when he goes to Carthage, which is a famous trope in the story, and operas have been written about it and their relationship, and it doesn't end well, does it?
No, because she kills herself, because he leaves her.
Right.
And the reason he leaves her is it is his duty and his fate to found a city in Italy. And she has founded a city, Carthage, in North Africa. And so he turns up on the shores of North Africa. He realises he's amongst civilised human beings. He and Dido have an affair. Dido falls in love with him because she hears this wonderful story of how he had to leave Troy. He had to leave his wife behind. He brought his father with him, carried him on his back, his father Anchises. He brings his little boy, and she falls in love with his little boy because he's such a sweet little boy. So you get this whole love story. But the problem is, Aeneas is not fated, he is not intended to stop at Carthage.
And in book 4, they have sex, don't they?
They meet in a cave.
After a storm.
Yes, and they consummate.
You know why I know this?
How? You've been there.
No,
You've seen the cave of Dido.
I got sent out of class, right? So my teacher is there some great line like inter se luxu fovent or something?
Yes.
It's a wonderful kind of euphemism where they enjoyed their luxuries together.
Yes.
And from the back of the class, this idiot went, "Hey!"
And that was you, was it?
That was me. And I was sent out, and I never heard the rest of book 4. And then, cut to when I was being interviewed for my place at Cambridge, Dr. Killen, now Professor Killen, asked me to explain some of the imagery of book 4. And I kept having to drag him back to book 6, because that's the book. I knew very little about book 4.
You're into book 6, aren't you?
I love book 6.
Into the Underworld.
It's one of those things where I think it's about a man having to confront his past before he can live his destiny. And I think that in the modern world, there are very few places where a human being can have that experience, because we're so averse to feeling sad. We're so averse to unpacking the past and making amends or putting things right. It's all about the endorphin rush of the phone going off. And I think that kind of deep descent, which in his case was a literal descent. I mean, he went down into the underworld. I've been to Kumai. I've seen where they said the entrance is, and they've got the passage carved into the rock where he goes into the underworld, and he meets his father, he meets Dido. That's a fantastic scene where Aeneas meets the ghost of Dido, and he's such a bloke, isn't he? He can't find the words.
No, well, he says, "Invitus regina tuo delitore cessi," which means, "Unwilling, queen, did I withdraw from your shore." So,
does she buy that?
No,
come on.
She is an unforgiving woman. She says nothing. She stares at him and turns and walks back. And she's a shade at this point. She's the ghost of Dido.
Yeah.
He cannot get forgiveness for her. It's a fantastic scene, because you realise that he's left her because he feels he must. He has a duty. We don't know where this duty comes from, but he learns about his duty in dreams, in prophecies. He keeps on being told it is your duty to found Rome, to take your ancestral gods, of course he's bringing them from Troy, and to put them as the gods of Rome.
But she doesn't, it sounds like an excuse to her, doesn't it? It sounds like it's a kind of, I think as a man, I kind of empathise with him a bit, is that to try and find the words to make it all right was difficult for him. And she turns away and then just goes back into the shade. So and what I love about that is that it's the irredeemable part of him. He can't redeem that part. And actually, I think that, again, if you think about living your life, is there a part of your life which are irredeemable that you can't put right? And you have to accept that. But for a modern psychology now, I think that is very difficult. People want things all wrapped up and neat and dealt with. But actually, I think life's a bit of a mess. And we're all down here on the planet trying to make sense of it. And here we see a man trying to put it right, and it's never going to be right, and he has to accept that.
And there's also something about the idea of a descent into the underworld that, if one tries to make it more figurative, it's a bit like going down into our unconscious.
Exactly.
And asking ourselves, what is it that I need to do in order to move forward? What are the demons, in a way, that I need to dispel before I can move forward? And the idea of a descent is something that is also very common in ancient literature. It goes all the way back to Homer, where Odysseus, the hero of the Odyssey, goes down to the underworld, and he meets, amongst other things, his mother, who he didn't know had died while he was on his travels. So that's very touching, a very touching moment. But Virgil makes something more of it. So when you think of the Odyssey of Homer, from which he takes this idea of a descent to the underworld and meeting the ghosts of the dead, is 8th century BC. Virgil is writing in the 1st century BC, 700 years later, taking some of these tropes, including descent, katabasis as it's known in Greek, and the idea that you descend in order to become more knowledgeable about yourself and your future. That's something that has happened in between. It's Plato. So Plato in the 5th century BC uses the notion of a descent. In fact, it's the very first word of Plato's Republic is I descended. And it's actually Socrates saying, I went down to the Piraeus. But he uses that particular word because the Republic is all about getting greater knowledge by descending into a realm of thought and then emerging from it enlightened. And this was something that the Greeks also believed happened in what they had, these mystery cults, mystery religions, where the idea was that you died for a moment in order to see what it was like to be dead, and then you come into the world enlightened about what is on the other side.
But this has a direct route into modern, psychotherapeutic practices.
Very, very similar.
I mean, it's completely it's exactly the same. I mean, if you think about the work of Carl Jung, and he was obsessed with myths and the archetypes that lie around in our collective unconscious, and the idea of going into yourself and going down and to dig deep into your unconscious to find out some of these forces that are, in some cases, for some people who are pathological, taking them outside of normal parameters of behavior. And he says, well, we're going to go down and find out where they are. These are complexes which you're not aware of. When you bring them up into the daylight, into the conscious mind, then you can deal with them. They lose their power.
So in Aeneas' case, they don't lose their power in the sense that they give him additional power. So amongst the other things that he sees in the underworld are the souls of the heroes of the future, the Rome of today.
One last thing. Where does Romulus fit into all this?
Romulus is a descendant of Aeneas many generations later. So Aeneas doesn't actually found Rome. Aeneas
what are we talking about then?
He founds a city in Latium called Lavinium, and Lavinium then becomes Alba Longa, and Alba Longa eventually is the place from which Romulus and Remus come, and Romulus turns it into Rome. So that's his name. That's where
that's
the
a
name
whole other
Rome.
podcast, because the whole
it's hundreds of years later.
Didn't Romulus kill Remus?
Yes, indeed. Romulus kills Remus.
The Cain and Abel thing going on there.
Indeed. So Rome is actually based on a story of the killing of a brother.
Yes. I actually attended a lecture where someone was saying, had Remus killed Romulus, we would have never had Rome. We'd have had Reme. And we'd have been talking about the ancient Remans.
Doesn't work, does it?
I quite like that.
It's All Greek and Latin to Me is presented by Armand and Jimmy Mulville. The producer is Diggory Waite, and the executive producer is Claire Broughton. It's All Greek and Latin to Me is a hat-trick podcast.
Hi everyone, I just wanted to give a mention to Classics for All. Classics for All is a charity, and what we want to do is provide access to the classics to as many state school pupils as possible, alongside training teachers who don't actually have to have any previous training in the subject. They hope that they make classics a sustainable part of the school curriculum. If you want to find out more about this fantastic charity, go to the website. It's www.classicsforall.org.uk.